He stood there across from me in the HR director's office, his face going pale as the file slid across the polished wooden desk. I watched his reaction carefully. This was the moment. The director, a woman named Patricia with steel grey eyes and a no-nonsense demeanour, kept her voice steady and professional. Your father-in-law's company is acquiring us. He requested a review of certain employee comments made during informal gatherings. She opened the folder slowly, deliberately, letting the moment sink in. She laid out emails, screenshots of messages, audio recordings. His voice was unmistakable on those recordings, clear and cruel and confident. He's broke. That's why he always shows up here on Friday afternoons. Free food, free drinks, someone to listen to his pathetic stories about his glory days. The man just shows up uninvited half the time, my wife's father, a total deadweight. I just smile and nod, but honestly I feel bad for him. Living like that at his age, no real job, no real money. He needs us. We're like his only friends. Patricia looked him directly in the eye with the kind of expression that told him there would be no negotiation, no second chances. We take workplace harassment and verbal abuse of family members very seriously at this organisation. These comments, made publicly in front of multiple witnesses, recorded by multiple employees, constitute a pattern of deliberate disrespect towards someone directly connected to a principal stakeholder. You're terminated, effective immediately. He never looked at me, not once. He'd kept his eyes on the desk, then the folder, then the wall behind Patricia, but never at me, standing in the corner where the director had asked me to stand as a representative of the acquiring company. His hands shook slightly as he picked up the folder. Patricia's assistant will escort you to collect your personal items and will be present while you do so. Your final paycheck will be mailed to your address. A security officer will be outside to see you out. Is there anything you'd like to say? He said nothing. He just stood up, pushed the chair back, and left. The door closed. Patricia turned to me and nodded slightly. Thank you for coming in. That's taken care of. But I wasn't thinking about the termination or the efficiency of the HR process. I wasn't thinking about the professional way Patricia had handled it, or the effectiveness of the evidence I'd gathered. I was thinking about the weeks and months and years that had led to this moment. I was thinking about how long I'd kept quiet, how long I'd let this man say these things about me, paint me as a failure, turn me into a kind of family joke, how long I'd tolerated it for Emily's sake. Let me go back. Let me tell you what actually happened, because this didn't just come out of nowhere. This wasn't some sudden emotional decision I made to destroy my son-in-law. This wasn't revenge born from a momentary anger. This was the result of years of patience finally running out, of years of observation and understanding finally crystallizing into action. This was strategy, actually. Cold, calculated strategy. And it all started with one simple comment that cut deeper than he probably even realized at the time. Let me take you back about 3 weeks before that HR meeting. I need to set the stage properly, because you won't understand the weight of this moment unless you understand who I actually am, what I've built and what I'm capable of. The thing about being successful is that sometimes people don't see you the way you actually exist in the world. They see what you show them, or worse, what they assume about you. My name is David. I'm 58 years old, and I built a company from nothing. Not from my father's money, not from an inheritance, not from some lucky break. I started with a computer, a phone line in my apartment, and an idea that nobody thought would work. That was 34 years ago. My first office was 200 square feet. I had one employee. Today my company operates in 47 states and we're expanding internationally. We employ over 12,000 people. I personally sit on the board of 3 Fortune 500 companies. But here's the thing about building something like that. You become a certain kind of person. You learn how to read people, how to understand what drives them, what makes them tick. You learn how to see through the noise and the BS. You learn how to plan several moves ahead, like you're playing chess at a level most people don't even know exists. My wife Jennifer is amazing. She came into my life at a time when I was completely consumed by work. She was working as a therapist at the time, and she had this incredible ability to see me as a human, not as a title or a net worth. She loved the actual person underneath all the business success. We got married 17 years ago. We had one daughter, Emily, and she's everything to both of us. Jennifer always said the best thing about me wasn't my business acumen. It was my ability to stay grounded and remember where I came from. That matters, she'd tell me. That's what separates good people from the kind who lose themselves to their own success. Jennifer was the one who pushed me to give back, to volunteer with young entrepreneurs, to mentor people. She was the one who reminded me on nights when I was stressed about quarterly reports that there was more to life than quarterly reports. She grounded me. She still does. Emily grew up in that environment. She watched her parents work, build, struggle, succeed. She learned the value of money by seeing what it actually took to earn it. She didn't grow up spoiled. I made sure of that. She had a part-time job in high school. She paid for half of her college tuition herself, even though I could have paid for all of it. She understood that nothing comes free, that everything has a cost, and that the cost of achievement is work and persistence and sometimes failure. She became a lawyer, a good one. Criminal defense, which made Jennifer nervous sometimes because Jennifer worried Emily was going to run into dangerous people. But Emily was smarter than her mother's fears. She was calculated and careful, and she was good at her job. She won cases that other lawyers said were unwinnable. She made a name for herself in the legal community before she was 30. 6 years ago, Emily met Brandon at a law conference. He was charming, funny, attentive in that way that makes women feel seen. At least that's what Emily said when she introduced him to us. Brandon was working in commercial real estate. He was making decent money. He seemed responsible. He asked all the right questions. He complimented her intelligence. He made her feel important. He seemed genuinely interested in her career, in her cases, in her thoughts on legal strategy. At least that's what it looked like from the outside. I noticed some things, small things at first. The way his eyes would flick toward me during conversations to gauge my reaction. He was assessing me, measuring me, calculating what I represented in terms of opportunity. The questions about my business, always framed casually, but with a precision that suggested he was trying to figure out exactly how much money I had. How much money was at stake if he married Emily? What kind of access he might gain through marriage to my daughter? The way he'd position himself as an equal in the room, even though we'd never actually had a real conversation about his work or his background. It was subtle manipulation, the kind of thing most people wouldn't notice if they weren't paying attention. But I'd spent 34 years reading boardrooms and people, building a business through understanding human nature, and I could see the mechanism working underneath his smile like gears turning inside a clock. But Emily was in love, and my wife was happy, and I wasn't going to be one of those fathers who tried to sabotage his daughter's relationship based on intuition. Besides, I had been wrong about people before. Not often, but it happened. So I said nothing. I watched. I listened. I paid attention to everything. Brandon and Emily dated for 2 years before he proposed. 2 years of those calculated questions, those subtle looks, those performances of being the perfect boyfriend. 2 years of him learning everything he could about my business and my finances. Jennifer cried when he proposed. Emily was radiant, truly happy, and that was the only thing that mattered to me at that moment. My job was to be supportive and pay for a nice wedding, which I did without hesitation. The wedding cost about $200,000. I didn't bat an eye at that number. I wanted my daughter to have the wedding she dreamed of. Brandon's family contributed almost nothing. Almost nothing. I found that strange, to be honest. When I asked Emily about it delicately, she said his parents had some financial difficulties and were stretched too thin. I accepted that explanation, though it registered somewhere in my mind as unusual. It added another data point to my understanding of Brandon's background. Most families try to contribute something, even if it's modest, even if it's painful. They find a way. I mentioned it to Jennifer later, and she said I was being unfair, that not everyone had family money or successful careers, that I shouldn't judge people based on their family circumstances. She was right about that. I let it go. Brandon and Emily moved into a nice house in the suburbs. I helped with the down payment. That was another clue, actually. When I asked Brandon if his family was helping, he said they wanted to but couldn't, and he asked if I had any advice about financing. The way he asked was subtle, like he was asking for advice from a peer. But what he was really doing was testing to see if I'd offer money. I offered nothing that day. He was disappointed. I could see it. Jennifer and I had decided early on that we would be generous with Emily, but we weren't going to enable anyone else's sense of entitlement. Brandon got a job with one of the larger commercial real estate firms in the city. He seemed to do okay, though Emily mentioned a few times that he was frustrated with his commission structure and felt like he wasn't being compensated fairly for his work. Classic complaint. Almost everyone feels that way about their job, but Brandon seemed to feel it more intensely than most people. He'd complain about his boss, his colleagues, about how people were always trying to hold him back, trying to keep him from achieving his potential. The victim mentality was strong with him. He had big plans, he told Jennifer. He was going to start his own firm someday, be his own boss, answer to nobody. Ambitious. That's not inherently a bad thing. Lots of people have that dream. But the way he talked about it suggested he saw his current job as something beneath him, people as things to be manipulated for his own advancement, and success as something owed to him rather than earned through work and persistence. He didn't have that hunger born from real struggle. He just had resentment. He started coming to family dinners regularly. At first it was special occasions, holidays, celebrations. Then it became weekly. Friday nights, Brandon would show up around 6 and I'd have dinner prepared. Jennifer would cook something nice. We'd open a good bottle of wine. He'd eat, he'd talk, and he'd always seem to be studying me during those conversations, looking for an angle, looking for a way in. His eyes would track my movements. He'd notice when I mentioned a business deal, a contract, a successful merger. He'd file it all away in that calculating mind of his. Jennifer loved having him there. She said it meant Emily was happy, that the family was expanding and bonding. She was right in a way. But I was watching a man spend 5 hours a week eating my food, drinking my wine, and clearly cataloguing my assets in his mind, estimating what I was worth, thinking about succession plans that involved him. He'd ask questions about my business in a way that seemed like casual interest but was actually quite calculated. How many employees do you have now? How's the revenue looking? Are you planning any major expansion? What's your take on the market conditions? Who's in line to take over when you eventually step back? These aren't the questions someone asks to make conversation. These are the questions someone asks when they're trying to understand cash flow and opportunity, when they're trying to figure out if there's room for them at the table. Years of boardroom negotiations had taught me to recognize a probe when I heard one. I knew the difference between genuine curiosity and calculated intelligence gathering. After about a year of this, Jennifer noticed that I seemed distant around Brandon. She asked me what was wrong. I didn't want to worry her or make her feel like I was judging Emily's choice, so I told her the truth, just phrased gently. I said I thought Brandon was strategic in a way that felt off to me, that I didn't think he was being genuine. Jennifer said I was being paranoid, that not everyone had ulterior motives, that maybe some people were just interested in getting to know their in-laws. And she was right that my instinct had been wrong before, so I decided to do something different. I decided to be the best version of a father-in-law I could be. I was nice to Brandon. I asked him about his work. I listened to his responses. I made him feel welcome. I asked Jennifer to invite him more often. I wanted to give him every opportunity to prove me wrong. I wanted to see the best in him, like Jennifer saw the best in him, like Emily saw the best in him. But what happened instead is that every week, every single week, I became more certain that my original instinct had been right. He was performing. He was wearing a mask. And underneath it was someone calculating and opportunistic and hungry for something he hadn't earned. But I said nothing. I just smiled and poured the wine and asked questions about his week. The performance continued. Emily and Brandon had been married for almost 4 years when things started to shift. The Friday night dinners continued, but Brandon seemed different, more confident somehow, like he'd figured something out, like he'd cracked a code. He started making jokes about my business, light jokes, but with an edge to them. He'd say things like, "How long do you think you can keep up this pace? Or aren't you getting tired? You should think about retirement. Let someone younger run things." They were presented as jokes, meant to be funny, but they were actually probing questions designed to make me think about my own mortality and perhaps my successor plans. I realized what he was doing. He was trying to position himself as that successor. He was trying to make himself invaluable. He was trying to create a scenario in his mind where Emily inherited my company, and he stood next to her as the helpful husband. I still said nothing. I just laughed and changed the subject. Then, about 6 months ago, something shifted in how Brandon talked to others, when he thought I wasn't really paying attention. I started noticing it during family gatherings. Emily was close with her cousin Marcus. He'd come to dinner sometimes with his family, and I noticed Brandon would talk differently around him, less guarded, more critical of me. He'd make comments like, David's business sense is outdated. The old school approach doesn't work anymore. He's stuck in the past. Or he'd criticize my lifestyle. He's so frugal for someone with that much money. He never lets loose. The guy's basically a miser. He'll probably die with all that money still in the bank, never actually living. What a waste. I heard these comments because I'd learned long ago to pay attention to what people said when they thought you weren't listening. They were testing the waters with my family to see if there was any resentment toward me, any vulnerability they could exploit, any fracture in the family loyalty they could widen. People like Brandon operate on opportunities. They're always looking for an opening, a way to position themselves better, a way to gain advantage. But the other thing Brandon did was something I paid even more attention to. He started talking about money constantly, his own money problems, which apparently were significant and growing. I found out through Emily that he'd made some bad investments, that he'd taken out loans for ventures that hadn't paid off, that he was stressed about finances. Emily was sympathetic. She wanted to help. She didn't know the details of my finances or the details of my will, but she knew her father was successful, and she probably thought that meant everything would work out eventually. She kept saying things like, Dad could help if there was a real emergency, but she wasn't suggesting I actually ask him. She was just saying it would be possible. Brandon heard those comments differently than Jennifer intended them. He heard them as opportunity. He heard them as evidence that money was available, that all he had to do was find a way to access it. I sat down with Emily about 6 months ago, and we had a conversation about my estate planning. Not because of Brandon, but because Jennifer had been pushing me to be responsible about these things. Emily needed to know that her future was secure, that she didn't need to worry, that she could make life choices based on what made her happy and not based on financial anxiety. We sat in my office. Emily asked me directly, "Do you think Brandon is trustworthy?" I remember that question. I remember considering how to answer it truthfully without making Emily defensive. I told her that I'd learned long ago that people change based on circumstances, that some people could be trusted when money wasn't at stake, but when money became involved, their true nature emerged. Emily asked me if I thought Brandon would steal from the family. I said, I think Brandon would do whatever he felt he needed to do to survive. That's not the same as being a thief, but it's not the same as being trustworthy either. We updated everything that day. My will is very clear. Emily gets the bulk of my estate, but there are specific conditions about who controls what and how trusts are structured. Brandon gets nothing directly. Nothing. Not a penny if Emily leaves him. If Emily and Brandon were to divorce, he'd have no claim on what I'd built. If anything happened to Emily, the money goes to her children, or if she has no children, it goes to charity. I had been protecting my daughter's future without even fully realizing why I felt I needed to do it. But I think on some level I knew. I knew that Brandon was looking at my money the way people look at a piece of property they want to develop. Not with love, not with gratitude, but with possibility and entitlement, the way a predator looks at prey. Fast forward to last month. Everything came to a head at a company event. One of our corporate partners was hosting a dinner at a nice restaurant downtown. It was a casual networking thing, nothing too formal, but it was important for relationship building, for maintaining the connections that make business run smoothly. I brought Jennifer. Emily came with me. Brandon came. Brandon didn't work for my company. He was just there as Emily's husband, a tag-along really, someone who didn't belong but was there anyway because my daughter loved him. Throughout the evening, Brandon drank more than usual. Not drunk, not obviously so, but definitely looser than his normal controlled self. His guard was down. He was drinking like a man trying to find courage at the bottom of a glass. He was standing near the bar with two of my employees, senior people who worked directly under me, people who trusted me and respected me and had built their careers because of the opportunities I'd given them. And I heard him. His voice cut through the background noise like a knife, unmistakable and cruel. He was laughing. He was telling them about me, treating me like a joke, like I was someone to mock. He's broke, the man said. Not that he was broke, but he's broke. Like it was a fact. Like it was something those men should know about their boss's father-in-law. That's why he always shows up here on Friday afternoons. Free food, free drinks, someone to listen to his pathetic stories about the old days. He said it with such confidence, such certainty, like he'd figured me out. Like he understood something about me that nobody else saw. I felt something crystallize inside me at that moment. Something cold and definite. I've been a lot of things in my life. I've been ambitious. I've been ruthless in business. I've fired people. I've negotiated deals that made competitors weep. I've pushed people to their limits to make them better. I've been strategic and I've been calculating and I've been willing to do what needed to be done. But I have never been pathetic. I have never begged for table scraps, and I am certainly not broke. That comment, in that moment, in front of those people, something shifted inside me permanently. Something in me decided that this man had finally crossed a line from which there was no going back. This wasn't going to end with a conversation or a family discussion. This was going to end with consequences. He was going to be taught a lesson. He was going to learn what it meant to mock the wrong person. He was going to learn what it meant to humiliate someone who had every resource and every capability to make him suffer. And he was going to learn it in a way that would haunt him for the rest of his life. I spent that night awake, sitting in my office with the lights off, staring out at the city lights below. My hands were steady, my breathing was even, but inside me something had shifted into focus. I'd built a business by reading situations, by understanding where power lay and how to move things in your favour. I'd negotiated deals worth billions. I'd outmaneuvered competitors who thought they had me cornered. I'd survived market crashes and regulatory challenges that would have destroyed lesser companies, and I had never in all that time let someone publicly humiliate me without response. But this was different. This wasn't business. This was personal. This was my family's reputation. This was someone positioning himself to take from what I'd built by destroying my character first, by making me a joke, by suggesting I was a parasite living off of them. That required a different kind of response, a colder one, a more calculated one. I spent the next few days gathering information. I used resources at my disposal. I had people who could look into things discreetly, people who owed me favours, people who understood that discretion was part of the compensation. The kind of people you don't ask too many questions of, you just say what you need and they deliver. I needed to understand Brandon's world, every detail, every vulnerability, every piece of leverage that existed. I learned some very interesting things about Brandon's employer. The real estate firm he worked for, the one he complained about constantly, the one he said didn't appreciate his talents and held him back, was in financial trouble. Serious trouble. Not bankruptcy level, not yet, but they were bleeding money faster than a ship with a hole in the hull. Bad investments, poor market timing, aggressive expansion into markets they didn't understand. Their owner was an older gentleman named Richard who'd built the business 40 years ago but had lost the ability to adapt. He was stuck in old methods while the market moved faster than he could follow. The firm had about 170 employees spread across 3 offices, the main office in downtown, 2 satellite locations in the suburbs. They did decent revenue, maybe $45 million a year, but their margins were collapsing and they were burning through capital at an alarming rate. My investigators pulled their tax records, their client lists, their personnel files. They looked at their banking relationships, their debt structure, their line of credit status. They talked to clients, anonymously, just gauging satisfaction. They identified which relationships were strong and which were fragile. They looked at staff turnover. In the last 2 years alone, they'd lost their top 5 earners. Turnover was high, morale was low, people were scared, people were looking for exits. That was important. That was useful. I had my team run the numbers. I brought in my best financial analysts. We looked at their assets, their contracts, their client relationships, their liability exposure. Within a week, we had a complete picture of a company that was worth far less than its owner probably thought it was worth. Worth, in fact, almost nothing if the market shifted another 5% in the wrong direction. Worth pennies on the dollar, worth an opportunity. I met with my board members, not the full board, 4 members, the ones I knew would understand strategy and wouldn't get bogged down in morality. I brought them in on a Friday afternoon and walked them through what we'd found. I had charts, I had financials, I had projections, I had everything laid out systematically. This isn't about real estate, I told them. Real estate is cyclical, and I'm not interested in taking on those assets long term. This is about opportunity, about positioning, about something else entirely. I'm looking at this as a 2 to 3 year hold, maybe less. Acquire, restructure, sell. I said it confidently, like I'd already made the decision, and was just informing them. They asked me what I meant. I told them we were going to make an acquisition. We were going to buy the firm, not for the real estate division itself, but because it gave us something we needed, something strategically valuable. They looked at each other with confusion. One of them said, "I'm not following. What do we need from a struggling real estate firm?" I smiled. I said, "It's not what we need from them. It's what having them gives us. Access. Insight." My chief operations officer understood first. She's the smartest person in the room most days. She nodded slowly and said, "You want access to their employee base, You want to understand their internal communications and operations. You want visibility. I said, exactly. They still didn't get it. One of them said, why? Just tell us why you want this company. I said, personal reasons, and left it at that. They said, that's not good enough for a board decision. We need a business rationale. So I told them the truth. I said, my son-in-law works there. He's been hostile toward me, competitive in ways that suggest he's trying to position himself as a threat to my family's financial security. He's in financial trouble, real trouble. He's desperate. He's making moves that could damage the family. If we own the company, we see everything. We understand where his vulnerabilities are, what he's doing, who he's talking to, what his real financial situation is, and if there's a need to take action to protect our interests, we have the mechanisms in place to do it. They understood then. They didn't like it, but they understood. One of them said, this seems vindictive. This seems personal. I said, it's strategic. There's a difference. But sure, call it what you want. What matters is that it's not illegal and it's not unethical from a business standpoint. We're evaluating a potential acquisition. We're doing due diligence. That's completely standard. What we do with the information after we acquire is our business. We're not breaking any laws. We're not violating any regulations. We're just being thorough. They voted 4-1 in favour. 1 member abstained. She didn't believe in the ethics of what I was doing, but that was fine. I had the votes I needed. Her abstention meant she wouldn't actively fight me, and that was enough. I contacted Richard, the owner, directly. I didn't go through brokers. I didn't announce anything publicly. I didn't give him time to prepare his defences or line up allies. I picked up the phone on a Tuesday morning and I called him. Richard, it's David. I know who you are, he said immediately. Everyone knows who you are. There was something in his tone, respect mixed with wariness. He knew I didn't call people casually. I said, I'm interested in discussing a potential acquisition of your firm. He laughed. He actually laughed. He said, are you serious? I said, completely. Richard said, we're not for sale. I said, everyone's for sale at the right price. Richard said, not us, not our company. We've been independent for 40 years. We're not interested in being absorbed by some corporate giant. I said, that's what everyone says until they see the numbers. I'd like to send someone to look at your books. Richard said, absolutely not. I said, Richard, I'm going to acquire your company. It might take 6 months or it might take 2 years, but it's going to happen. That's not a threat. That's just reality. The question is whether you cooperate and get a fair price now, or whether I go through the market, start making moves with your competitors, your clients, your talent, and acquire you anyway after I've damaged your value considerably. There was silence on the line. Then he said, you're bluffing. I said, I'm not. But you don't need to believe me. Just think about it. He said, I'll think about it, and hung up. That was fine. He would think about it. He would lose sleep over it. He would imagine all the ways I could destroy his company, and some of those imaginings would be worse than the reality would ever be. Fear is a powerful motivator. Fear makes people make decisions they wouldn't normally make. That was fine. I didn't need his permission to start the process. I had my team identify which of his employees might be vulnerable. His operations manager had been passed over for promotion twice, once 3 years ago when someone else got the job he deserved, and again more recently when Richard promoted his own nephew instead. His lead accountant had been looking for a job elsewhere for months, sending out resumes, going to interviews, getting rejected or getting offers that weren't quite right. His marketing director was frustrated with the lack of technology investment, desperate to implement new systems that Richard kept saying they couldn't afford. These people weren't disloyal, they were just tired. Tired of not being recognized, tired of not being valued, tired of working in a company where the best strategy seemed to be just to keep doing things the way they'd always been done. And when you're tired enough, when you've been disappointed enough, opportunity looks like a life raft. I authorized my team to make discreet offers, not to poach them immediately, but to let them know that if they were interested in coming to work for us, there would be roles available, substantial roles, better titles, better compensation, better benefits, better prospects, positions where their skills would be valued instead of overlooked. We didn't even have to twist arms. These people came to us. 3 people took the bait immediately. 2 others said they'd think about it, and within a month they were calling us back asking if the opportunity still existed. Within 6 weeks I had detailed operational knowledge of Richard's firm that was almost forensic in its completeness. I knew his client base down to individual relationships and which clients were on the verge of leaving. I knew his contracts, their terms, their profitability. I knew his revenue streams and which were growing and which were declining. I knew his cash flow, his burn rate, how long he could sustain operations if revenue dropped. I knew which clients were likely to leave if there was instability. I knew which ones were loyal and would stay even if the company changed hands. I knew about the sexual harassment lawsuit he'd paid off quietly 2 years ago, the one his legal counsel had advised him not to mention to anyone. I knew about the tax issues his controller was worried about, the grey areas in how they'd accounted for some deferred revenue. I knew that his top salesman was looking to start his own firm and was already in talks with potential investors, and I knew who those investors were. I knew everything that mattered, and most importantly, I knew that Brandon was drowning in debt and was becoming increasingly unstable about it. He was making risky moves. He was borrowing from people he shouldn't borrow from. People with names like Tommy and Vic. People who ran operations that weren't exactly legitimate. He was having increasingly angry conversations with his spouse because he wasn't being honest about his financial situation. He'd lied about bonuses he didn't receive. He'd lied about commissions he hadn't earned. Emily knew something was wrong, but she didn't know how deep it went. She didn't know that her husband was in debt to the kind of people who break kneecaps over unpaid gambling losses. She didn't know that his desperation was turning into something darker, something violent. I also learned that Brandon had been talking to potential lenders about starting his own real estate firm. Not just talking. He'd actually approached 3 different venture capital firms with business plans, formal meetings, presentations. He'd spent money he didn't have getting materials designed, getting his pitch prepared. He'd invested time and hope into this fantasy of becoming his own boss, making his own rules, proving that everyone who'd ever doubted him was wrong. All 3 firms had rejected him. His business plan was weak. His track record didn't justify the confidence he had in his own abilities. His presentation was unconvincing. One of the venture capitalists told my investigator that Brandon had seemed almost desperate during the pitch, like this was his last chance, like everything depended on them saying yes. He was desperate for his big break, for the thing that would validate him, for the opportunity that would prove everyone wrong, and he didn't have it. He wasn't going to get it. He was middling at best and delusional at worst. He had talent, maybe, in small measures, but he didn't have the discipline or the intelligence to translate that talent into sustained success. He was a man who wanted to be exceptional, but would never be anything more than average. And that incompetence, that inability to achieve, that gap between his ambitions and his capabilities, that was turning him into something bitter and cruel. He was lashing out at people, at me, because the world wasn't giving him what he felt he was owed. I brought in a private equity firm I'd worked with before, Crawford Capital. They're good, they're experienced, they understand complex deals and they understand discretion. I told them I wanted to acquire Richard's real estate company, but I wanted it to look like they were the ones making the acquisition. I wanted them to be the face of it. I didn't want my fingerprints on it. They asked me why. I said, it's complicated. They understood that I wasn't going to explain and that I didn't need to. We structured it so that my company would fund the deal, but their firm would be the public buyer. They'd be the lead, the ones making the strategic decisions, the ones announcing the acquisition to the market. They understood what I was really trying to do, and they were happy to help. It would make them look good to have made this acquisition. It would add to their portfolio. It would demonstrate their ability to find value where others saw distress. They didn't care about my personal motivations. They didn't ask too many questions. They just cared that the deal made financial sense from their perspective and that they'd be positioned as the smart investors who'd spotted an opportunity. We moved forward with the deal structure. The acquisition closed after 90 days of negotiations and due diligence. The private equity firm announced it publicly as their successful acquisition of a real estate company with strong market presence and growth potential. They gave a press release. They issued statements about their plans for the company. They talked about implementing new operational systems, investing in technology, repositioning the brand for modern markets. It was all standard acquisition language, industry boilerplate. Nobody outside the company knew that the real reason for the acquisition was to monitor one mid-level employee who'd made the mistake of humiliating the wrong man. Nobody knew that this entire transaction was a chess move in a personal vendetta. From the outside, it looked like a normal business acquisition by a private equity firm. From the inside, it was surgical and calculated. Richard tried to fight it at first. He called me back within 3 days trying to negotiate. He said, "If you're willing to invest in the company, why not just do that?" "Why take it over?" I said, "Because I'd have to deal with you, and we both know that wouldn't work." He didn't like that answer. He tried to convince his board members that selling was a mistake, that the company had value they weren't seeing, that with better leadership and some patience everything would turn around. His board listened politely. Then one of them said, "Richard, when's the last time we had a year-over-year revenue increase?" Richard couldn't answer that. He couldn't point to growth because there wasn't any. He tried to reach out to clients directly and tell them the company wasn't really being sold, that it was just a restructuring, that everything would be fine, that they should continue their relationships as normal. But the damage was already done. There was instability. There was uncertainty. And in business, uncertainty kills relationships. One of his top 3 clients started taking bids from other firms. That was the beginning of the end. Board members who'd been worried about the company's future suddenly became very interested in liquidity. The senior board members who understood fiduciary duty realized they were sitting on a sinking ship, and that getting out with a decent return was better than staying and watching everything go down. And when my team came in and presented the financial realities, when they showed the projections and the burn rates and the declining market share, board members who'd been in the dark for years suddenly understood how close they'd come to losing everything. They realized that Richard had been downplaying the severity of the situation. They realized they were lucky someone was offering to buy. They voted to accept the offer. Richard got a decent payout. He could have gotten far less if I'd pushed harder. I could have waited, could have let his situation deteriorate further, could have driven down the price. But I wasn't trying to destroy him. I was trying to destroy Brandon. Richard was just collateral damage, and I didn't need to be cruel about it. The first thing I did after closing was put in a new management structure. I kept most of Richard's people. They weren't the problem. They were just caught in the middle of a dying company. I brought in my own operations manager who answered directly to me. Someone I trusted completely. Someone who understood what I needed and why I needed it without requiring a full explanation. I brought in a compliance officer who reported to me. Her job was to ensure that everything we were doing was legal, that we weren't crossing any lines, that we had documentation for everything. I instructed them both that I wanted complete visibility into email communications, chat systems, recorded calls, everything that went on in that office. I wanted to know what people were saying, what deals were being made, who was communicating with whom. I wanted patterns. I wanted context. I wanted to understand the office dynamics and personalities, because that information would be useful. Some of this required employee consent, so we had them all sign new employee agreements during the onboarding process with the new owners. We called it standard stuff. New ownership, new policies. It's typical when a company gets acquired. Everyone goes through an orientation. Everyone signs paperwork. It's procedural. Everyone signed because nobody was going to risk their job over questioning paperwork. The agreements gave us broad rights to monitor communications for compliance purposes. It was all legally sound. It was all defensible. It was also exactly what I needed. Brandon didn't know any of this was connected to him. As far as he knew, his company was simply being acquired by a private equity firm, Crawford Capital, a firm he'd heard of, respected, saw as sophisticated and professional. He had no way of knowing that I'd arranged the entire thing. He had no way of knowing that I'd orchestrated the acquisition specifically so that I could monitor him, so that I could see into his world and understand exactly who he was when nobody was watching. He might lose his job, he might stay, he might get a promotion. There was uncertainty, which made him nervous, which made him vulnerable. But he also saw opportunity. He saw it as a chance. An acquisition meant changes. Changes meant opportunities for people who were smart enough to position themselves. He started working harder immediately. He started showing up earlier. He started networking more with the leadership team that was coming in. He tried to position himself as an essential employee to the new ownership. He started talking differently about his career prospects, at least when he was at work. Maybe, he probably thought, maybe this was the break he needed. Maybe new ownership would see his potential where the old ownership had been blind to it. Maybe they'd see him as someone worth investing in, someone worth promoting, someone worth trusting with bigger responsibilities. And then we started collecting what we needed. We set up a situation. We had my operations manager approach Brandon privately and tell him he was being considered for a senior position. The real estate firm was going to expand into commercial development, and they wanted people with entrepreneurial mindset, people with ambition, people who understood the next generation of real estate possibilities, people who could think bigger than the current market allowed. Was he interested? Of course he was interested. His entire face changed. This was what he'd been waiting for. This was validation. This was his moment. When they told him there would be a company gathering, a networking event with partners and investors, a place where he could showcase his skills and his vision to the decision makers, he prepared for it like it was an audition for his entire future. He bought a new suit. He got his hair cut. He practiced his pitch. He researched the investors who'd be there. He prepared talking points. He was meticulous about it. He started drinking before he arrived at the event. I think he was nervous. Nervous about performing. Nervous about not being impressive enough. Nervous that this opportunity would slip through his fingers like all the others had. I think he was desperately hopeful that this would be his moment, the moment where everything changed, where people finally understood his value. And my people recorded everything. The audio, the video, they captured him with his guard down, his mask off, his true self on display. Professional equipment, high quality, nothing that would be questioned. He moved through that event like he was trying to convince everyone that he belonged in the room. Talking too much, laughing too loud, taking up too much space, performing for an imaginary audience of investors who didn't exist. And when he started talking about me, when he started telling my employees that I was broke, that I showed up to Friday dinners for free food, that I was pathetic, that I was a deadweight, they listened with sympathetic expressions while phones recorded every word, every inflection, every cruel laugh. They let him go on. They asked follow-up questions that got him to elaborate. They enabled his performance while capturing it all. They were professional about it. They didn't push too hard. They just let his own bitterness spill out naturally, on the record documented. It took 3 days to compile everything and get it to my legal team. Audio was clean, crystal clear, no background noise. Video was usable, professionally shot. Context was perfect. We had a man with leverage and opportunity saying terrible things about someone connected to a major stakeholder. He'd done it at a company event. He'd done it in front of company employees. He'd documented his own harassment through his own words. Then we just let it happen. We let Patricia do her job. We let HR do their job. We let the consequences flow naturally from what he'd created. We made one call to make sure the file got to her desk at the right moment. We made sure the recordings were properly formatted and absolutely clear, no room for doubt or argument. And then it happened exactly as I'd planned. The termination, the humiliation, the moment when he realized he'd been set up but had no idea how deep the setup went. He never looked at me in that office. He never made eye contact. His world had collapsed in a moment. His dream of advancement within the company had turned into his permanent record. His aspirations had become his evidence. The HR meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning at 10 o'clock. Patricia, the HR director, had called Brandon on Tuesday night and left a voicemail. Professional, courteous, non-committal. Just the tone of someone scheduling a routine meeting. Nothing in her voice suggested what was actually coming. He probably spent 2 days trying to figure out what it could be about. A promotion discussion? A warning about his job performance? Maybe something about the event? Maybe they'd seen something they wanted to talk through? I imagine he ran through a dozen scenarios, each one more anxiety-inducing than the last. I was there when he arrived. I was sitting in Patricia's office on the opposite side of a small round table. Brandon stopped in the doorway when he saw me. His face went through a series of expressions very quickly. Confusion, then understanding, then something that looked like fear mixed with anger. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "What is he doing here?" he asked, addressing Patricia but staring at me. Patricia gestured for him to sit down. "Please take a seat," she said. Brandon didn't sit. He just stood there, staring at me, trying to figure out what this meant. I kept my expression neutral. I didn't smile. I didn't acknowledge him in any particular way. I just sat there, calm and composed, waiting for Patricia to do her job. "Your father-in-law's company is acquiring Crawford Capital's stake in this organisation," Patricia began. She had a folder on the desk in front of her. As part of the transition process, we've been asked to conduct a review of certain employee communications and behaviours. She opened the folder slowly, deliberately. There are recordings here from last week's networking event, and also some email communications. Your comments about your family member have raised some concerns. Brandon's face was draining of colour. I could see him starting to calculate, starting to understand. He was trying to figure out how to spin this, how to defend himself, how to make it go away. Patricia pressed play on a small speaker. Brandon's voice came through, slightly slurred, not completely drunk, but definitely having had a few drinks. He was talking to someone about me, saying I was broke, saying I showed up to family dinners for the free food, saying I was pathetic, a deadweight, past my prime. The words hung in the air of the office like a bad smell nobody wanted to acknowledge. Patricia turned off the recording. "Do you have any response to this?" she asked. Brandon looked between her and me. He was trapped. His mouth opened and closed like a fish trying to breathe in air. "That was just joking around," he finally said. "That's how guys talk. That's locker room banter. It wasn't serious." Patricia didn't buy it. I could see it in her face. She pulled out another document, an email thread where Brandon had been talking to 2 colleagues about how I was a burden to the family, how Emily had wasted her potential marrying into my legacy, how I was living off her earnings and pretending to have money. Written communication, time-stamped, documented. No way to claim it was just words said in a moment. He'd taken the time to write it, to send it, to participate in a chain of correspondence where multiple people were mocking me and my family. "That's just venting," he said weakly. "Everyone vents about their family. That's normal." Patricia didn't respond to that. She just pulled another document out of the folder, a video file printout, transcription of footage from the event showing him making similar comments while being recorded, his body language aggressive, his tone contemptuous. Multiple instances, multiple witnesses, multiple forms of evidence, all collected within a professional context because he'd made a choice to do this at a company event. Made a choice to say these things where employees were present. Made a choice to humiliate me in front of people who worked in a company my ownership interest now controlled. "I'm going to be honest with you," Patricia said. "I've worked in HR for 17 years. I've seen employees say inappropriate things about family members before. It happens. But what I'm looking at here is a pattern of deliberate, sustained, intentional harassment directed at someone connected to a major stakeholder, recorded during a company event, documented in written communications, and combined with what we've found in your personnel file, it's clear that your continued employment here presents a problem for us." Brandon's eyes widened. "What problem? What are you talking about?" "Your performance metrics," she continued, pulling out yet another file. "Looking at the last 2 years, your conversion rate on leads is 17% below the department average. Your client retention is down. You've had 3 complaints filed against you for inappropriate workplace conduct. None of them rose to the level of formal discipline, but they're in your file and they paint a picture." I could see him starting to panic. He looked at me again, and this time there was something different in his expression. Not just anger, desperation. He was looking at me like I could somehow make this stop, like I still had power over the outcome, like this conversation wasn't already decided, like my presence in the room was something that could be negotiated with, instead of something that was already certain. "Based on all of this," Patricia said, "and with the guidance of our legal counsel, we've made a decision. Your employment is terminated effective immediately. You'll receive 2 weeks of severance as outlined in your employment agreement, but your access to company systems will be revoked immediately, and you're to vacate the premises within the hour. A security guard will accompany you to gather your personal items." Brandon stood completely still. It didn't seem real to him. He was staring at Patricia like she'd just spoken in a language he didn't understand. "Terminated," he said. "You're firing me? Over some jokes? Over venting about my father-in-law? That's not fair. That's not legal. That's harassment." Patricia's expression didn't change. "Legal has reviewed this. We're fully protected. You signed an employment agreement that explicitly covers this situation. Inappropriate conduct directed at company stakeholders, creating a hostile work environment, documented harassment. Your behavior violated multiple clauses. We're well within our rights, and well within legal guidelines." She said it calmly, professionally, like she'd been through this before and knew exactly how it would go. Because she had been through it before, we'd made sure of that. We'd made sure Patricia understood the situation. We'd made sure she had all the documentation she needed. We'd made sure there was no ambiguity, no room for argument, no way for him to fight back and win. He turned to look at me again. "This is you," he said. "This is what you did. You set this up. You planned this." His voice was shaking. I just looked at him. I didn't say anything. There was nothing I needed to say. The The file on the table said everything. The recording said everything. The email said everything. My presence in the room said everything. He finally understood. He finally realized that this wasn't random. This wasn't bad luck. This wasn't some unfortunate series of coincidences. This was planned. This was orchestrated. This was revenge executed with the precision of someone who had spent decades learning how to dismantle people's lives in ways that were completely legal and completely unavoidable. Security knocked on the door. Patricia stood up. "I think we're done here," she said. A guard came in, professional but unmistakable in purpose. "They're going to escort you to collect your personal items," Patricia continued. "You have until 11 o'clock to leave the building. After that, you're trespassing." Brandon looked at the guard, then back at Patricia, then at me. His face was going through emotions so fast I couldn't keep track of them. Disbelief, anger, fear, humiliation. He finally looked me directly in the eye, and I saw the exact moment he understood. He understood that I'd orchestrated all of this. He understood that his company being acquired wasn't a coincidence. He understood that this meeting wasn't a surprise review of his comments. He understood that I'd arranged the entire thing specifically to destroy him, specifically to humiliate him, specifically to make sure that his world fell apart in front of witnesses in the most final and permanent way possible. He didn't say anything. He just turned and walked out with the guard. He never looked back. He never tried to argue further. He just left. The door closed behind him with a soft click and Patricia sat back down. "That's done," she said, looking at me. I nodded. "That's done," I agreed. She closed the folder. "This doesn't need to go any further," I said. "I mean, the company's attitude toward this situation, the thoroughness of the review, the professionalism of the termination, all of that should remain private. Between us." Patricia understood. She understood perfectly. Discretion was part of the arrangement. The goal wasn't to embarrass him publicly. The goal was to destroy him privately, to make him understand that actions have consequences, to show him that humiliating someone connected to me wasn't a risk he could take and walk away from, to teach him that there are people with the power and the patience to plan revenge over months and execute it perfectly. I left the office about 15 minutes after he did. I didn't hang around. There was nothing else to see. It was done. But I did drive past the employee parking lot before I left. I watched him loading his box of personal items into his car. His hands were shaking. He looked like someone whose world had just ended because it had. He looked like someone who'd just realized that the man he'd been mocking, the man he'd called a deadweight, the man he'd publicly humiliated, was the same man who'd just orchestrated his complete professional destruction. He looked defeated. He looked broken. There was a moment where our eyes met across the parking lot. He'd just closed the trunk of his car and he looked up, perhaps sensing someone watching him. He saw me standing there by my vehicle, watching him, and I could see him process it. I could see him realize that I hadn't just been present at the meeting by accident, that I'd orchestrated it, that I'd planned every detail of his destruction, that this was something I'd been working toward for months. His face went white. His mouth opened like he wanted to say something, but nothing came out. Then he got into his car and left. I watched him drive away, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard I thought they might crush it from where I was standing. I drove home and I didn't feel anything in particular. I thought I would feel triumphant. I thought there'd be some satisfaction in finally executing the plan, in seeing it work perfectly, in watching his face when he realized what had happened. But there wasn't. There was just a kind of cold clarity. He'd made a choice. He'd decided to humiliate me. He decided to make himself my enemy. And I'd responded by using every tool at my disposal to make sure he paid for that choice. That was it. That was the whole equation. Action and reaction. Cause and effect. Nothing more complicated than that. The satisfaction, if there was any, wasn't in seeing him suffer. It was in knowing that I'd executed a plan so perfectly that he never saw it coming, that I'd used his own company against him, that I'd used the structure of ordinary business practices to dismantle his career in a way that was completely legal and completely unavoidable. Emily found out 3 hours later. Someone at the office called her. Not an official call, not HR reaching out, but someone she was friends with who'd heard that her husband had been fired. She called me immediately. Her voice was shaking. She asked me if I knew anything about it, if I was involved in it. I told her the truth. I told her exactly what I'd done. I told her about acquiring the company. I told her about the recordings. I told her about the plan. I told her everything. She was silent for a long time after I finished explaining. When she finally spoke, she asked me how I could do that, how I could orchestrate something like that without telling her, how I could destroy her husband's career without her knowing, how I could be so cruel. Those were the words she used. Cruel. Like I'd done something wrong. Like the plan was unjustified. Like Brandon hadn't earned what he got. I told her that he'd earned exactly what he got. That if he hadn't publicly humiliated me, if he hadn't spent time mocking me to people at his workplace, if he hadn't sent emails to colleagues calling me a deadweight, none of this would have happened. But he did those things. He made a choice. I just made sure there were consequences. She said she needed time to process. She said she might need some space. She asked if I could come pick her up from the office because she couldn't drive right now, couldn't think straight. I went and got her. She sat in my car with her hands folded in her lap and didn't say anything the entire drive. When we got to my house, she went into the guest bedroom and closed the door. She didn't come out for dinner. She didn't come out to talk. She just stayed in there, and I assume she was on the phone with Brandon, or trying to be, or processing what it meant that her husband had just lost his job because of something I'd orchestrated. The next day, Brandon showed up at my house. He came alone, without Emily, and he knocked on the door with a lot of force. Too much force. I could tell through the wood that he was angry. I opened the door, and he was standing there with his jaw clenched and his hands in fists. "You destroyed my career," he said, over some harmless comments, over jokes. He was nearly shouting. I stayed calm. "They weren't harmless," I said. "They were deliberate and documented, and they happened at a company event where you were representing an organisation I had ownership interest in. Those were the facts. That's what you did. That's why you're not employed there anymore." He said I was a vindictive old man. He said I was abusing my power. He said this was illegal, that it was retaliation, that he could sue me. I told him to feel free to try. I told him that every action I'd taken was legal and defensible. The company was acquired by a private equity firm, and during the integration process, we conducted routine reviews of employee communications. We found problematic conduct. We took action. There was nothing illegal about any of it. I told him that his comments about me, recorded at a company event, would make defending any lawsuit against me very difficult. I told him that his best option was to move forward and find another job and stop dwelling on the past. He called me every name I'd ever heard, some I hadn't heard in years. He said I was the problem, that if I'd been a better father-in-law he wouldn't have felt the need to vent about me, that it was my fault for being so condescending, so superior, so dismissive of him, that I'd pushed him to say those things, that I was responsible for his unemployment. I let him finish. I didn't argue. I didn't try to debate him. I just listened to him rage and rage and rage until finally he seemed to run out of things to say. Then I told him that Emily was upstairs and probably wanted to see him, and I closed the door. Emily came downstairs a few hours after he left. She'd been in the guest room the whole time. She asked me if I was going to do this for every mistake he made, if I was going to orchestrate professional destruction every time someone in my family did something I didn't like. I asked her if she thought what he did was acceptable, if she thought publicly humiliating me was okay, if she thought mockery of family members was just something people did and moved on from. She didn't answer. She just looked tired. She looked hurt. She looked like she was mourning something that had died, and in a way, something had died. Her marriage was starting to fracture under the weight of what had just happened. She told me that Brandon was saying he was going to fight me, that he was going to hire a lawyer and pursue legal action, that he was going to find some way to make me pay for what I'd done. I told her that was his right, that he could pursue whatever legal action he wanted, that the courts would side with me because everything I'd done was legal. She said that wasn't the point. The point was that I'd been willing to destroy her marriage in order to get revenge on him, that I'd put her in a position where she had to choose between her husband and her father, that even if what I'd done was legal, it wasn't right. It wasn't ethical. It wasn't the kind of thing a father should do to his daughter. I asked her what she wanted me to do. Apologize? Undo the termination? Have a conversation with Patricia and ask her to rehire him? She didn't answer. I think she realized that there wasn't any undo button. There wasn't any way to go back to the way things were before. Brandon had made his choice when he decided to mock me in front of his colleagues. He'd made his choice when he sent those emails. He'd made his choice when he showed up at that networking event with the intention of humiliating me. And once he made that choice, the consequences became inevitable. The only variable was how those consequences would arrive. And I'd decided to deliver them in a way that was calculated, legal, and impossible to escape. She asked me if I was going to say anything to her about it, if I was going to explain myself, if I was going to tell her that I'd meant well or that I'd done it for her own good, or that she'd understand someday. I didn't say any of those things. I just told her that I was her father and that I'd protected what was mine. That was all there was to say. She asked for a divorce about a week later, not directly, not in a conversation where she sat down and told me clearly what she wanted, but through her lawyer, through paperwork, through the formal machinery of ending a marriage, the reconciliation that might have been possible if Brandon had simply apologized, if he'd taken responsibility for what he'd said, if he'd tried to make it right, never happened. He just stayed angry. He just stayed convinced that I was the villain in his story. He never once apologized to Emily for putting her in a position where she had to choose between him and her family. He never once acknowledged that his actions had consequences. He just stayed bitter and angry and convinced of his own righteousness. The divorce took about 4 months to finalize. Emily moved out of the house they'd bought together. Brandon got a job at a different real estate firm, one that didn't involve any of my business interests. He was making less money than he had before. His new position was lower in the hierarchy. His prospects were significantly diminished. Everything he'd said he didn't want, everything he'd been afraid of had come to pass. Not because I'd made it happen after the termination, but because the termination itself had created consequences that cascaded through his life in ways he probably hadn't anticipated. The word had gotten around in the real estate industry about why he'd been fired. Not the official reason, not the HR explanation, but the real reason. Whispers, rumours, the kind of reputation damage that follows someone in a tight professional community and makes every subsequent opportunity a little smaller, a little less lucrative, a little more questionable. I never had another conversation with him after that day at my door. We didn't speak at family gatherings because there were no more family gatherings that included both of us. Emily would come to dinner at my house. Brandon would show up if it was his custody weekend with any children they might have had, but they didn't have any, so that never happened. My sister eventually stopped inviting both of them to things. People had to choose sides. Most people chose Emily's side because she was family and because she was the one who'd been betrayed by her husband's behaviour. Some family members told me I'd been too harsh, that I'd overreacted, that what Brandon had said was just the kind of thing men said to each other, and that I shouldn't have taken it so seriously. But those people had never been publicly humiliated by someone they'd welcomed into their family. Those people had never felt the sting of mockery from someone they'd tried to include. Those people had never faced the choice between accepting humiliation or responding to it. They could afford to be philosophical about it because it had never happened to them. I don't know if what I did was right. I know it was legal. I know it was planned carefully and executed perfectly. I know that every action I took was defensible and documented. I know that Brandon's career suffered significantly and that there was nothing illegal about that suffering. I know that Emily's marriage fell apart because of Brandon's choices and then my response to those choices. But I don't know if that means I did the right thing. I know I did what I thought was necessary. I know I responded to being publicly humiliated in the way I believed was appropriate given my resources and my abilities. I know that when someone disrespects me, when someone mocks me publicly, when someone tries to diminish me in front of others, I have the power to make sure there are consequences, and I used that power. Some people might call that justice. Some people might call it revenge. Some people might call it something in between. All I know is that Brandon never humiliated me again. He never made jokes about me to co-workers. He never sent emails to colleagues about what a burden I was. He learned that actions have consequences. He learned that some people have the resources and the patience to plan an appropriate response. He learned that mocking the wrong person can be the decision that changes the trajectory of your entire life. And maybe that's what needed to happen. Maybe some people need to learn those lessons the hard way. Maybe some people won't understand boundaries and consequences until they experience them directly, personally, in a way that affects their lives completely. What I'm certain of is this. The moment Brandon chose to mock me and spread that mockery to his colleagues, he made a decision. He decided that I was someone worth disrespecting, someone worth treating with contempt. And I responded the only way I knew how. Not with anger, though I was angry. Not with violence, though I was tempted. But with the one thing I had in abundance that he didn't. power. The power to plan something over months that would destroy his carefully constructed career in a single afternoon. The power to make sure that when he walked out of that HR meeting, his life would never be the same again. If he'd simply apologized, if he'd shown remorse, if he'd acknowledged his wrongdoing and tried to make amends, this might have gone differently. But he didn't. He stayed angry. He stayed defensive. He stayed convinced that I was the villain and that he was the victim of my vindictiveness. He never once understood that his own actions led directly to his own destruction. That was perhaps the cruelest part. Not that I destroyed him, but that he still doesn't understand why. That he probably goes through life convinced that I wronged him, when he simply learned a lesson he should have learned earlier. The world doesn't exist to validate you. People don't owe you respect simply because you're related to them, and when you cross someone with the resources and patience to respond in kind, you may not like what happens next.